So good morning, everyone joining from South Asia, and good morning and good evening to all the colleagues joining from other parts of the world, including our two expert speakers who are joined from the US. My name is Anurag Mishra. I work at USAID India office as a senior clean energy specialist. So on behalf of the US Agency for International Development, it is my privilege to welcome you all to the South Asia Energy Series webinar on scaling grid-connected distributed solar in South Asia. As we all know, most countries in South Asia face a common set of challenges, and that hinder their ability to achieve the fundamental energy access goals. They utilize a limited set of resources to generate electricity, and mostly through centralized generation units. And they depend heavily on imported fuels, which impedes their energy security. These countries also face serious challenges due to the inadequate and inefficient transmission and distribution systems. Fortunately, the whole of South Asia region is kind of blessed with a wide variety of renewable energy resources, which can be used for generating renewables in terms of distributed as well as centralized resources. One of the most common resources available in abundance in this region is solar. As we see it like every day, that sun comes out and that resource is available for us to use. And this distributed solar potential, if it is kind of fully developed, it can support regions' existing future energy needs and also accelerate the transition to low carbon energy systems across South Asia. Distributed solar, or as we all call it as rooftop solar, can be used to power homes and businesses. It can address many of the common challenges faced by South Asian countries, such as land constraints to develop large solar projects, the need to build large transmission lines, which takes a lot of time and investment, reduce the transmission and distribution losses. As we understand, that is one of the major challenges faced by distribution utilities across the region. And finally, also drive investment from consumers, reducing the burden on public agencies. And there are many more benefits of developing a distributed solar, rooftop solar in the region. In addition, as we all know, that rooftop solar can also support the recovery post-pandemic, especially the economic impacts, by helping the businesses becoming more competitive and sustainable by reducing their power costs by using the cheaper resources like distributed solar. Most of the countries in South Asia have already established programs and initiatives to drive the deployment of distributed solar. Sri Lanka's Surya Bala Samagre program is looking at deploying 1 gigawatt of rooftop solar capacity by 2025. Bangladesh has identified an opportunity for 2 gigawatt of rooftop solar on government buildings and an equally large potential across the textile industry, the key economic sector of the country. Nepal's urban solar program is supporting rooftop solar deployment in all the electrified areas of the country. So today we have gathered to discuss some of the next generation interventions which could address the critical challenges faced in scaling rooftop solar in South Asia. These experiences emerging from India, but also from other parts of the world, really reinforce that we have to actively looking into supporting this market, starting from some of the basic requirement in building the ecosystem, but quickly move to the next level of interventions, which will require kind of additional efforts at the level of policymakers as well as the regulators. So today we are joined by a set of international experts who have worked in various countries to share their experience through this webinar. But before I invite our speaker, I would like to mention a few housekeeping rules. Please use Q&A function for asking your questions. There is a tab at the bottom. You can put your general comments in the chat function if it is not a specific question. And if you are putting any question, please also mention the name of the speaker to whom the question is addressed so that we can appropriately come to that speaker and request that. With this, let me introduce and invite our first speaker, Dr. Rakesh Goyal, to set the context for today's discussion. Dr. Goyal has 30 years of experience in the power sector and serves as a vice president at Tata Tech in India. He has worked across a full value chain of the power sector in about 20 different countries in Asia, America, and Africa. At present, Dr. Goyal leads the USAID's PhD 2.0 RE program in India. So over to you, Dr. Goyal, to take forward the presentation.
Thank you, Anurag. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and privilege to share my thoughts on this important topic of scaling grid-connected solar in South Asia in this regional webinar. The South Asia region has diversity of RE resources, such as Bangladesh has predominantly solar and biomass, Nepal has microhydel, Maldives and Bhutan solar and wind, and Sri Lanka and India has oil. We all know several years back how Bangladesh has by off-grid solar and Nepal by off-grid microhydel generation has shown the world successfully a way to electrify all corners of the country with clean energy sources. Friends, now the time has come to have grid-connected distributive generation from our resources. We all know distributive generation has several advantages, such as low upfront cost, less losses, reduced network requirement, better reliability, and quality of power besides the financial and economic advantage we get by use of clean energy. But there are several challenges. To address some of the challenges in USAID PhD 2.0 RE program, we have developed few concepts, model, and did some analysis, what we call as the new generation initiatives. And these concepts, models, and analysis can be applied for distributive generation from almost all our resources and are not just limited to solar. Scaling of distributed generation will be accelerated if all stakeholders are satisfied. Different stakeholders have different challenges, interests, and concerns. In this webinar, we would like to share what are those and how they can be addressed. I will do the soft work of providing the overview, and my colleagues will deep dive with you with some of the solutions we developed in USAID PhD 2.0 RE program for that. The stakeholder concerns and solutions we are going to talk here are common to this region and are not specific to India, although they have been tested and debated in India. Can I have the next slide, please? So as you see in the slide, there are four main stakeholders for the distributive generation: customer, DISCOM, government, and investor or RESCO. I have put investor and RESCO in one bucket, but sometimes their requirements are little different. The stakeholders have challenges, concerns, and more importantly, perception. Few critical issues are perception-based, and our analysis reveals that factor contradictory to perception. We'll come in next slides. What are those? The stakeholders can be satisfied by appropriate policies, procedures, and business models. So scaling takes place if all stakeholders are satisfied. Let us understand what the challenges for each stakeholder. Now, the first stakeholder that we see is the customer. Now, the most important stakeholder. Now, some of the customers will adopt grid-connected solar to support clean energy, but they are few. Most look forward to the reduction of their electricity bill versus their investment. There are several analyses which demonstrate that it is highly profitable to customers. The typical payback for the 25 years life of the solar plant is 8 to 10 years. But the concern from customer side is investment has to be made upfront, and recovery is slow by reduction of the monthly electricity bill. With this slow recovery, and many times small customers actually do not have money for initial investment, it becomes difficult for customers to deploy solar rooftop despite their desirability and understanding. As per bank and government, the procedure to take loan or financing from bank is simplified, but customers does not feel that way. They still feel the procedure and difficulties of getting finance. Thus, it requires further simplification and publicity. We developed a business model called Super Resco, which does not require upfront investment from customers. My colleague Sumit will share with you. Most of the government are providing subsidy through impaneled EPC from which customers can choose. But customer has no idea about their service and quality of EPC. And many times, EPC provide substandard design, workmanship, and product to keep the price low and get empaneled. Now, the vendor rating system, which is developed in the PhD program, will try to fill this gap. Can I have the next slide, please? So the next important stakeholder is DISCOM. Now, DISCOM is very important stakeholder, but often their involvement is not much as it requires. In most South Asian countries, DISCOMs are passive facilitator for something that is taking place between customer and government. DISCOM feel that solar rooftop will reduce their business and revenue. However, truth is, if DISCOM take the role of generator and facilitator, DISCOM can make profit. And this is the analysis we will show. For example, the generation cost from solar now is much lower than generation cost from fossil fuel, and there is no fuel pass through. So that means that cost is almost constant for next 25 years. Therefore, DISCOM is getting generation from solar rooftop at a lower price than from present fossil fuel based generation. Secondly, domestic and specifically low-paying customers are generally at the tail end of the network. The cost of supply electricity to them is higher from average cost of supply, while revenue recovery is lower than average revenue recovery due to the low subsidized tariff. One of the reasons of high cost supplies is the technical and commercial losses in the flow of electrons from generator to customers. In distributive generations, we are installing the generation at the customer premises. So we are cutting the transmission or the road from which the electrons flow from generator to the customers. Now, what it happens? It reduces cost of supply and the T&D losses both. That is why we often recommend starting solar and rooftop program where T&D losses are high. In distributed solar generation program, DISCOM has two main gains from low cost generation and secondly from low cost supply by reduced T&D losses. T&D losses with tail-end low paying customer is historical struggle point of most of the DISCOMs in South Asia. And this issue of installing solar rooftop addresses that T&D loss reduction program also automatically because the path of transmission or distribution of electricity gets cut. This aspect of the reduction of T&D losses is often overlooked by the DISCOMs while doing the financial equation. And we have brought it upfront and included in our analysis. My colleagues will share with you in the upcoming presentation. The other challenge DISCOM think that large-scale deployment of solar rooftop will result in excess generation during the day. These are ways to take care of it by appropriate tariff signal, which is a very standard way, time of the day tariff. So if you have a supply higher, you reduce the tariff. If you have a demand higher, you increase the tariff, which is prevalent in most South Asian countries, but during the evening time. Now the reverse can be applied here. But there is also a way by charging the batteries during the day and discharging them during evening when demand is high. Now current cost of battery is a road blocker, but as the steep decline expected in battery cost will take place, it will make a good solution. My colleagues from NREL, Karishma, will explain how to develop policy to increase behind the meter storage. Now the third important stakeholder in this is the investor or ESCO, which is concerned about the return of its capital as solar plant has a long life. They also are interested to deal with small customers. They wanted to avoid dealing directly with the small customers because their transaction cost is high. although many governments have made arrangements of low interest financing to their banks from donor banks such as ITCOL in Bangladesh, SBI and PNB in India, but simplification has not taken place in providing financing to RESCO investors. Banks are still asking for collateral guarantees, last 3 years positive balance sheet, etc., etc., which becomes an hindrance in getting the finance from the bank in spite of the availability of funds with them for this purpose only. Now, these are some of the things which need to be further simplified, maybe the partial risk guarantee, because banks wanted to ensure that their whatever loans and financing they give, they remain secure. So those solutions also need to be developed. In the Super RESCO business model, we try to address these concerns. Investors are also concerned about the selection of EPC because it impacts their profitability. If, for example, if there is a good EPC, the output or the electricity generation from the same plant will be much higher in comparison to the plant which is less efficient. And we have seen in several places at the same plane, there are two plants, but one is generating higher electricity, one is generating lower, which makes in a long term a major impact. So vendor rating framework will again try to address this issue also. The another aspect which is worrying from the investor side is that getting the subsidy from the government. Now, when the investors quote the price for the empanelments or the EPC quote the price for impanel, they are supposed to quote the price considering the subsidy. But when the subsidy they will get and how much time will it take? Those are still some of the concerns in the investor's mind, and because of that, they are not able to quote the most competitive prices. Once those things take care, probably the prices will come down further and better service can be provided. Can I have the next slide, please? So the fourth important stakeholder is the government. Now, the most critical question for government is what is the right level of subsidy for clean energy generation? Value of solar analysis adopted in 22 states in US provides some solution to this aspect. My colleague Naeem will share with you this complex but useful analysis, how it can be utilized in taking the clue for deciding the right amount of subsidy for that. We already discussed financing about. Then also the aspect which normally get mixed in deciding the subsidy is the economic gains in the form of new investment and the job creations which the state or the country gets. Safety is also one of the concern of the government. If any mishap take place, government is blamed first, irrespective of the fact that whether it is responsible or not. Vendor rating framework can address this issue also. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is my last slides, which provides a canvas of all the stakeholders' concerns. So 4 stakeholders that we mentioned, and here are their concerns. And in the bottom of the slide, there are 4 main activities or initiatives developed under the USAID PSD 2.0 RE program, which can help in resolving some of those challenges of the stakeholders. By color match, you can identify which challenge is getting addressed by which activity. My colleagues will share with you these 4 activities in detail now. Thank you, Anurag, and thank you, Pramod, for providing me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Goyal, and thanks for sticking to the time and finishing a minute earlier. So now it's time to hear from our expert speakers on the 4 interventions what Dr. Goyal has laid out. And starting our first speaker, Ms. Devina Anand. Ms. Anand has worked on projects and assignments focusing on policy and regulatory framework to support renewable energy deployment and empowering women in the energy sector. She has worked with multiple donor organizations such as ADB, World Bank, UNDP, and USAID. She was also a visiting researcher at the US Department of Energy, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab in California. So Devina will cover the important issue of quality and safety and what we learned from our experience here in India and what are the potential solutions for this. So over to you, Devina. You have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you, Anurag, and thank you for the lovely introduction. Good morning, everyone, to my colleagues and fellow participants from India, and good morning and good evening to the participants from other parts of the world. So my session today is on solar quality and safety issues and solution. We have 10 minutes, so it's going to be a short presentation, but my aim today is to walk you through all the major concepts of this study and understand the relevance and importance of the solar quality and safety issues and what can be the potential solutions. So without wasting much time, I think we should begin with the presentation. So thank you, Pramod. So yes, quality and safety aspects of solar PV is a major concern, and not just for one stakeholder, but for all the stakeholders, be it investors, regulators, consumers, or even distribution companies. And there is a lack of quality standards, yes, and there's a push for low prices also. So we see that more and more EPC players are today cutting down prices in order to be competitive and win jobs. And as a result, there is a compromise on the quality of the components, the systems, and the workmanship. Not only that, the equipment that does not follow the minimum quality standards create many safety risks for the business, the homeowners, as well as the building where these systems are installed. So the equipments are generally of inferior quality or poor quality standards, and the installation techniques are also not properly followed. So overall, both these safety concerns as well as the performance concerns lower the investor and consumer confidence. Now, it is important that we obey to certain international and national standards for component manufacturing or design, installation, and workmanship, as I just mentioned. And the most critical thing here is to implement a certain framework that checks the compliance to these standards and for enforcing standards and associated services. And the basic step for doing that is to understand the challenges that occur in the DPV and quality safety. And for that, USAID Phase 2.0 RE with NREL had performed a deep study and research that was bifurcated into 3 stages, which was a literature review, interviews, and followed by an in-person workshop. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it is important to understand that a significant portion of the overall life cycle cost comes up as an upfront investment during the deployment of the solar PV systems. And to recover the investment, it is critical that the components and the system perform as it is expected. And that can only happen when the quality of each stage conforms to the minimum quality standards. So here we can see that this is the solar PV project development chain, and this is divided into 3 stages. We have the design stage, we have the component procurement stage, and the installation stage. So the design, even under these stages, there are various methods and tasks that are done. So for the design stage, we have shadow analysis, then component selection. For the component procurement stage, we have work related to the inverters, structures, module mounting, and of course the installation stage, which covers activities such as site preparation, module installations, commissioning, including the operation and maintenance. Next slide, please. So for this part of the study that USAID Phase 2.0 and NREL did, they performed a survey and a literature review that showed that each of these distinct phases had specific issues. So if you see here, the stage of component procurement had maximum number of issues, and this was, which is almost 50%, and this was followed by the installation and O&M activity, which had 35% of the issues occurring in that part of the development chain, followed by the remaining 15%, which was seen in the design phase. And even under these phases, there were other activities that saw issues. For instance, under components, there were the modules that accounted for 15% of the issues and challenges. Then there were issues related to the structures. And similarly, for the installation and O&M, there were issues related to fasteners, handling of modules. And the same case is with the design stage, where array layout made up the maximum issues. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this study headed to analyze and see what are the issues and challenges. And these issues and challenges were further reconfirmed where over 50 professionals from the industry participated, and there was a deliberation on what could be the potential solutions that could address these issues and challenges. And this was a workshop that PhD2 and NREL developed a report that maps and captures all these issues and challenges. So here, based on all the based on what you say, the research and the analysis, we came out with a framework in practice. So this was the vendor rating framework, which I'm going to talk about in my following slides. Next slide, please. Yes. So vendor rating framework came up as the most recommended practice that would ensure that the quality of the vendors is maintained. And for this, now, what exactly is a vendor rating framework? So let me just put it in a basic statement. So vendor rating framework is a single point of reference for all the stakeholders to identify the top quality vendors. How do the top quality vendors are identified? So for this, there will be a vendor rating agency that is going to rate, evaluate, monitor, and test the vendors on the basis of certain parameters that are going to include the technical and the financial capacity, as well as the design and procurement installation. So this framework is going to allow all these stakeholders to come to one platform and compare the quality of the vendors and see and make the best choice that is available to them. Next slide, please. Yes, and one of the basic unique feature of this vendor rating framework is that it will be dynamic in nature. So the vendors will have an opportunity to continuously improve their quality. The rating will be time bound. So for instance, the validity will be for a period of 18 months, and through random sampling of systems, the sites of the vendors will be selected and then they will be tested. And the vendors will have the opportunity to improve the quality of their sites based on what rating they are getting on the sites that are being selected and inspected. Another feature is that a more maximum weightage of this vendor rating framework rating is being given to on-site inspections. So here we can see that 20% is captured by technical parameters, 10% by financial, and the maximum is managed by the on-site inspections, which will cover the installation, design, and the O&M phases of the specific system. Next slide, please. Now, to demonstrate the benefits of the vendor rating framework, a pilot test was done. And this was a very important stage where we got to understand how exactly the framework works and whether there are any gaps or lags that can come and managed, and in order to make the vendor rating framework more strengthened and more robust. So this was a pilot test that was conducted in India in the state of Gujarat, where 10 EPC players came voluntarily and participated in the system, and overall 50 sites were inspected, and the vendors were rated on the basis of these parameters that I just mentioned: technical, financial, and on-site inspections. And based on that, they were given a rating, and they were good practices and the bad practices that were seen. So there was an online meet in February 2021, which we just had, where the vendors came together on one platform and shared their experiences of participating in the system. Next slide, please. Last but not the least, just highlighting what were the key findings from the pilot. So here we can see that, yes, some of the EPC players had good practices. We can see good cable management, then proper design and installation of the modules. And then, of course, there were good protection systems in place. And through this vendor rating framework, we also see that there's a scope of improvement that is observed in module mounting structures. Then there were lack of customer training and awareness that was there. Then, of course, there was not proper documentation of the technical and financial components. And safety and accessibility was also seen as one of the key aspects where there was a lack of improvement. So I think this made us feel that the entire pilot just reestablished the need and the importance of a vendor rating framework. And we feel that the early launch and an all-India adoption of this system would greatly contribute to enhancing the quality and safety of rooftop PV systems. And as not just that, it was also going to motivate the vendors to continuously improve their systems as they continue to learn through the rating systems. So as a next step, the program is currently working with the vendor rating agency to roll out the VRF nationally. With this, I'll conclude my slides. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Devina, and excellent presentation. And highlighting the real need for having more market-based solutions in parallel to the government's efforts to provide standards as well as all their kind of specifications in the tenders. There is also a role for other kind of mechanisms to play that role. And also the issue of quality and safety where it emerges, and highlighting that is majorly coming at the stage when we are selecting the modules or we're selecting the design of the installation systems, and also during the operation and maintenance phase. So with this, let me turn to our next speaker, Mr. Sumed Agrawal. Mr. Sumed Agrawal has more than 15 years of experience leading teams and managing donor-funded projects on power sector reform across the US, UAE, Jordan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Japan. Mr. Agrawal serves as a technical lead for USAID's Partnership to Advance Clean Energy Deployment Project in India, and previously had worked with the planning division of Dubai Electricity and Water Authority and Tata Power Delhi Distribution Utility. So over to you, Sumit, to share the business model to drive rooftop solar investment for low-paying consumers, but also driving support for distribution utilities in terms of their loss reduction. Over to you, Sumit.
Thank you. A very good morning and namaste to everyone present here. I welcome our participants for dialing in this session, and thank you, Anurag, for your nice introduction, and SAREH team for having me here. I think the audience present here just heard a very thought-provoking and powerful presentation made by previous speaker on importance of quality and safety of DPV installations. And moving on to another concept on DPV, distributed PV, keeping in mind that the South Asian countries share similar interests and challenges. Very briefly, next 10 minutes, I would like to introduce you to a new utility-driven business model, which we have developed under the USAID PACE-T 2.0 RE program to encourage use of distributed solar by low-paying consumers and target reduction of technical and commercial losses. So Pramod, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. So India is basically undergoing a rapid transformation from its coal-based power sector to a renewable-rich portfolio. And with 100% electrification, government has set a target to reach 175 gigawatt of installed energy capacity by the end of the next year, that is 2022, and it is reflected in the pie chart here. A section of the pie chart shows 40 gigawatt target to be achieved for solar rooftop PV. I will say it as SPVRT in my presentation. And what I would like to reflect here and pause for a moment for our gathering is that the deployment, especially in the rooftop solar segment, has reached only 4.2 gigawatt, or around 10% of the total target till date. What I wanted to share here is that this slow rate of deployment needs to a closer look, as it has multiple reasons. One of the reasons is that the domestic category, especially the low-paying consumers, which make up the largest part of the overall category segmentation, has mostly stayed away from solar PV rooftop deployments. And both the consumers and the distribution utility have their own arguments for lower interest. Next slide, please. For the benefit of attendance here, low-paying consumer term is used for those consumers to whom cost of supplying electricity is higher than the tariff they are entitled to pay. Many of them predominantly are low-income households, small commercial or agricultural consumers, and whatever the margins are left, they are generally recouped by discoms in form of subsidies, which they either receive from state or cross-subsidizing from CNI consumers. So the challenge here remains that such consumers, they have inherent low tariff compared to the cost of supply, and that do not attract them to adopt solar PV. Another challenge in this area is that there is a very high upfront cost of installations. SPVRT per se is inherently a capital intensive technology and requires an upfront investment of around 42,000 to 50,000 INR, which is roughly around $400–500 per kilowatt. And this discourages many domestic consumers. Again, securing credit from a bank is a very cumbersome process, and most of the customers feel that the savings from SPVRT are not worth the time and cost. If we talk about the developers, like what Rakesh ji mentioned, that RESCOs or third-party developers, they run these SPVRT plants under a build, own, operate model, and RESCO's model has seen a very limited success due to the nature of having high transaction cost, the fragmented nature of this particular sector, DPV, difficult, where you have difficulties in customer acquisition, maintaining the sanctity of the contract, and most important primer is the aggregation of demand to achieve the economies of scale. When I talk about discoms, on discom front, there is a perception issue where utilities generally see SPVRT eroding their utility revenue base due to a gradual shift made by consumers under net metering arrangements, and also its ability to service its customers. And this has led to an inherent unwillingness to communicate benefits of solar rooftop PV by discoms. While on the contrary, these solar rooftop programs, if designed well with a focus on systemic benefits, can actually offer plethora of opportunities to discoms, as it acts as a very strong tool to reduce aggregated technical and commercial losses, which lowers the cost of supply and brings savings in subsidy to the state as well. I would like to underscore here that the pivot of this case lies in co-location of supply near or at the load centers, which is depicted in the diagram with the cost supply differences shown in my next slide. Next slide, Pramod. Yeah, so as you can see in this slide, through the solar PV rooftop systems, discoms actually get low cost power close to the load centers in comparison to centrally generated thermal power which travels a long distance. So basically the solar PV rooftop acts as an instrument to reduce technical and commercial losses in the most difficult pockets, as distance between the generation and consumption has reduced significantly. In addition, it also helps to reduce the network capacity, release the network capacity if deployed at a larger scale. So having said that, the case presented here has been tried in many forms before, such as consumer-owned capex models and RESCOs, but were inadequate to address key issues such as finance, the limited availability of finance, or payment and performance issues. So our PhD 2.0 RE team looked at a challenge from a very different angle and realized that well-designed business models, which is discom-led rather than a consumer-led or a RESCO-led, can focus on systemic benefits, can lead to reduction in power supply cost, and also create investments in communities. Next slide, please. So after a series of consultations with state government, utilities, consumers, regulators, and developers, we came up with a unique super ESCO model, which is shown here, that promises a facilitating environment for all the project participants. In this new public-private partnership model, utility basically aggregate demand for RESCOs and sign power purchase agreement with RESCOs to buy solar energy. RESCOs make capital investment and operate the solar rooftop systems, while consumers grant RESCOs use of their roof and receive financial compensation, which is mostly in form of discount in tariff or discount in electricity bill, or it can be leased rent for the roof. Next slide, please. In terms of challenges for consumers and discoms, there are no upfront investments, and low-paying consumers are not compelled to buy solar power or maintain plants, which actually reduces the investment and technology performance risk. When I consider the challenges, how is it met by for the developers, the unique selling point or the USP of this model lies in aggregation of capacity, which actually enables large procurements and having a credit worthiness due to a PPA signed, a tripartite agreement between consumers, DISCOM and RESCO, and utilizing a strong credit ratings of the utility to secure investment and source cheaper capital. If we look at the opportunities in the next slide, please, it amplifies revenue stream gains for all the stakeholders. Take, for example, consumers. They receive additional income from the roof, which is otherwise economically non-performing asset. For DISCOMs, we can focus on the areas with infrastructure congestion and high losses for solar PV rooftop deployment so as to maximize the benefits. And with DISCOMs as a trusted entities, developers benefit because they now have a stable revenue stream, having a much better contract sanctity as well as low payment risk. Next slide, please. So our team not only designed this particular model, but actually dip tested the efficacy of model on ground by collaborating with state of Assam and Jharkhand in India. And I thank very much to the utility professionals there who actually got deeply involved when we made the presentations to both state regulators, utilities, and developers. And I'm happy to state that this resulted Jharkhand deciding to go ahead with a pilot of 25 megawatt, and we have now helped the state to develop the tender documents and facilitating the tender release. For Assam, we have developed a report to test the low-paying consumer model in areas with high AT&C losses, which is very well received and appreciated. As I speak, the team is also preparing a white paper that magnifies the awareness of the concepts and the lessons learned from the ground implementations at national level, and intend to support Jharkhand to launch pilot by undertaking bid evaluations in due course. Next slide, please. So talking about in terms of numbers, a sneak peek on the financial and economic benefits for state revealed the strength of the model. For example, a 15% replacement of consumption by solar rooftop in Jharkhand can lead to a saving of whopping INR 1,800 million, not to mention the reduction in government direct state subsidy and cross subsidies. DISCOMs will be able to meet their solar renewable RPO targets without having to purchase RECs. And also it leads to a systemic gains for the state overall by creating job opportunities. So having said that, in the next slide, I rest my case with certain lessons which are learned or derived from our experiences. And this will be very useful to South Asian countries and participants in attendance here, as we face common regional energy issues. What we feel that to maximize the gain of the super RESCO model, it will be very prudent to use distributed PV for low-paying consumers as a method to topmost reduce the AT&C losses in pockets where DISCOM is struggling to reduce the losses. Like you can start with pockets with losses greater than 20%. For example, for India, we have losses in general around 22%, but that is the national average. We go, then the ranges is from 10 to 50% of losses at different pockets. For state and DISCOMs, it is a time to build the capacity of DISCOMs on how they can encourage participation of consumers. It can be in form of road shows, RWA meets, and basically prioritizing the demand aggregation concept. A procedure for consumer participation is something which needs to be relooked into because we feel it should be simple and with few paper requirements based on our experiences and discussions. And finally, this is one important point where developer selection has to be based on open competition, like we did for Jharkhand, by holding pre-bid meetings to attract bidders with strong management fundamentals and ensure a strong competition so that you have a reliable partner for a long term. So the list I presented here is an indicative and have strong outcomes based on our ground experience and desk research. Our audience may find knowledge useful in their context. So with this, let me conclude my speech here and thank each one of you for patiently listening to me today. And now I hand over the floor to Anurag to move ahead with the proceedings.
Thank you, Sumit. Excellent presentation and also good insights into the reason of kind of looking at this specific opportunity for the utilities, but then also presenting a kind of a solution through a new business model. So with this, now let me turn to our next speaker, Ms. Karishma Gokhale. She's a project leader, energy transitions at the US Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Lab. She has nearly 2 decades of experience working in the domestic as well as international programs, focused on clean energy planning, strategies in emerging markets, and power sector transformation. She is also leading NREL's work in India and Bangladesh. And Karishma will share with us the strategies to enable deployment of behind-the-meter energy storage along with rooftop solar, as these technologies are becoming more and more viable and efficient and provides a really good opportunities both for the utilities as well as for the consumers. So over to you, Karishma.
Thank you, Anurag. It's my pleasure to be here. So today I'll talk about some of the work we've done looking at regulatory frameworks for DPV, or distributed photovoltaics, plus storage, and some of the relevant components that regulators can consider in order to promote fair, efficient, and well-functioning programs for DPV plus storage resources. And while these considerations have been identified based on analyses of global experiences, which despite differences in power system context, they can still provide important lessons for power systems in South Asia. Next slide, please. So I'll briefly set the stage and provide some market and regional context before exploring why we might think of considering DPV plus storage regulations. And then I'll talk about some of the good practices and approaches to keep in mind as decision makers develop energy storage strategies. And then finally wrap up with some closing thoughts. So I'm only going to spend a few minutes reviewing storage growth and deployment because I think this is very familiar to most of us, and most of us are aware of these trends. The graphic here shows deployment in megawatts on the y-axis and then the year on the x-axis, with the different colors on the bars showing various state deployment numbers for the US for 2020. This shows both residential and non-residential behind the meter deployment. And so broadly, these storage applications include, demand charge management, resilience and backup purposes, storage being used for resilience and backup, and then time of use shifting, and really in markets like California, New York, and Vermont, utilities are exploring distributed energy storage for various grid services, including demand response and ancillary services. I'll make 2 more points here. Storage deployment is not necessarily linear and can expand exponentially. So you can even see from like 2000 in the last 4 years, even though it seems like pretty low deployment in 2016, in 2020, it's significantly higher. And in the US and in other jurisdictions around the world, we've noticed that storage deployment has thrived in markets that were previously driven by PV adoption. And then on this slide, you can also see that deployment is not happening evenly across states, but is at least in part being driven by policy and the regulatory state context. Next slide, please. So building on what I had just mentioned, customers have shown a willingness to pay for resilience and backup. So in the US, this is particularly apparent in areas where outages have occurred due to weather events such as fires and recently winter storms, with storage becoming an increasingly popular backup option. And so moving our focus to South Asia, customers in India and the region and across the region have been deploying behind the meter generation and storage. So whether it's diesel backup or lead acid batteries used in UPS, uninterrupted power supplies. And sort of now moving to DPV and other storage, lithium-ion storage opportunities. These storage systems that are used by customers to address their power system reliability issues is driven, mostly by customer preference rather than any specific government policy or program. And then there's also the issue of cross-subsidization and the deployment of DPV plus storage systems by larger commercial and industrial customers that can also then reduce utility cross-subsidy revenue. We are seeing countries consider various compensation mechanisms for PV, as you heard earlier today. Of course, net energy metering is common in the region, with certain countries and states also considering net billing programs. And then finally, countries in the region have ambitious clean energy targets, including specific targets for DPV and various pilots and initiatives for deploying advanced metering infrastructure, smart meters, data management systems to help enable this two-way communication between utilities and customers. So all of this to just say that, storage isn't new in this region, but storage interacting with the grid is perhaps more of a developing concept. As we see cost decline, we see improved technical capabilities and additional deployment. They all interact to drive higher penetration of more sophisticated grid assets. And South Asia is very well positioned to be a leader in this space. Next slide, please. So, this sort of mirrors what Rakesh presented in his opening remarks and captures some of the potential drivers for the various stakeholders for storage deployment. So for the customer, for the grid, and then also how can storage help support government objectives. Customers typically have two main reasons for deploying storage. One is just to get additional value. So whether that's in the terms of potential bill savings by shifting demand to take advantage of time of day charges, or the ability to provide additional resilience benefits. So for example, retail customers may want to use battery energy storage systems that charge from the grid or from a DPV system as a primary energy source to help manage some of the outage events they may be experiencing. Looking for the electric grid, under appropriate policy and regulatory conditions, storage can allow for higher levels of DPV penetration without adverse technical impacts. These systems can also help reduce operating costs, as mentioned earlier, by meeting peak demand, for example, or helping to reduce congestion, and then also helping potentially with deferring or avoiding network investments. And compared to other grid investments, deployment of DPV plus storage can also help mobilize investments in the power system from outside the retail rate base, which may be particularly interesting for cash-constrained utilities. And then finally, looking at from the government perspective, storage can help support and meet DPV goals and electrification targets, for example, as well as support the creation of jobs and economic activity. Next slide, please. So based on global good practices, this slide outlines a series of steps and some of the key considerations for regulators, policymakers, and other important stakeholders when designing DPV plus storage program. So, the first step, determining the desired role of DPV plus storage, is an important first step. Decision makers can consider a range of objectives, including the desired role and behavior of DPV plus storage systems to provide certain services in the power system, for example, or what is the appropriate level of financial or administrative burden for customers and the utility? What is that balance? And then, just providing operational transparency and safety. So these could be some of the objectives, and prioritizing these identified objectives can help regulators balance what can be a diverse and sometimes conflicting set of objectives to guide the overall design overall program design process. Next, designing appropriate compensation mechanisms for DPV plus storage can attempt to meet and balance objectives related to fair customer compensation and utility cost recovery, and also help support the desired role of DPV plus storage in the power system. So here we'd want to consider, what kinds of metering and billing arrangements might make sense. What are the retail design and cell design options that may be relevant for DPV plus storage customers, for example? And really, decisions surrounding compensation mechanisms also influence downstream decisions. So, for example, rules governing metering and technical configuration requirements for DPV plus storage can be designed to ensure that those desired compensation mechanisms can then be implemented. So technical configurations requirement, they do affect the ability of these systems to interact with the grid by potentially restricting certain flows of energy, and then ultimately influencing the role that these systems can play in the larger power system. So if planned just right, it can support both the customer and the grid. And like I previously mentioned, metering requirements enable the implementation of compensation mechanisms. And so they can be used to increase the visibility of these systems to the utility, but they also have, important cost considerations and implications for regulators to consider. Regulators play an important role in developing interconnection processes, either directly driving these efforts or overseeing utility efforts to do the same. Designing a process for DPV plus storage systems to interconnect to the power system in a safe and orderly manner requires, the development of rules to do a few things. One, rules to govern the procedures that utilities employ to manage interconnection application process, for example. Rules that govern how DPV plus storage equipment is expected to function and expected to perform, how it should interact with the power system, and then rules to govern how interconnection applications are screened and evaluated, with a specific focus on how a DPV plus storage system, say, might impact operations at a particular distribution circuit where the system will be connected and constructed. And so I'll close with this next slide. I know it was a lot, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion. But in closing, I'll say that although DPV plus storage systems may not currently be economical or currently economically attractive for most consumers in the region, developing strategic, forward-thinking policies, standards, and regulation can increase the likelihood of effective, efficient, and equitable incorporation of distributed energy resources into the power sector. So, customers will deploy storage regardless of policy, and most of the current deployment of behind-the-meter storage systems in India and the region are not fully equipped to provide any services beyond backup power. So, and nor are they required to, meaningfully interact with the power system, for example. And so, these systems may lack the sophistication to provide these additional grid services that we talked about. And so moving forward, with cost declines, with proactively designed regulations in place, utilities in the region really can be ready and well positioned for the opportunities presented by, large-scale deployment of customer-sited storage. to reduce operating costs and to improve power system reliability. So with that, I thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Karishma. Excellent presentation and also kind of thought-provoking in terms of why countries should start looking at this opportunity of behind-the-meter energy storage with rooftop solar systems. So I see there are already good questions coming in the Q&A box, so please keep adding your questions. And let me invite our next speaker, Mr. Dr. Naeem Dagru. Mr. Naeem is a Principal Scientific and Engineering Associate in the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Naeem researches renewable energy policy and economics, and specifically he examines the relationship between distributed energy markets, retail electricity rate design, and customer economics of renewables. He has advised governments, electricity utilities, regulators worldwide, including Mexico, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, and India. Over to you, Naeem.
Great. Thank you so much, Anurag, for the introduction. And today I'll be speaking shortly, just a small introduction to value of solar analyses and quantifying the benefits of DPV, an analysis that we have done in 2 states in India. And I'll be discussing a little bit more about what this analysis is and presenting some of the results we found in 2 states in India, as well as kind of policy implications of this. Next slide. And next slide. Great. So a value of solar study is understanding the economic and societal value of solar generation to the utility and to society at large. So it's understanding, I'll be going into more details as to what the components are. In recent years, as we've seen increasing levels of rooftop solar, there has been more attention that's been turned to matching rooftop solar compensation to the financial value it provides to the grid. There's some equity issues related to solar deployment that have come up with increasing penetration levels of rooftop solar. And there's also been an increased demand for data-driven decision-making, especially when it comes to regulatory issues around rooftop solar. Previous slide, actually. Great. So the value of solar study can do a few things. One is it quantifies the financial value of solar to utility and society. It can help evaluate the financial impacts of an existing rooftop solar program. It can inform future program designs, and it can really help utilities and regulators in targeting rooftop solar, which is in particularly high value locations. Next slide. Slide 5. Thanks. So the value of solar studies are actually quite common in the U.S. They've been since 2012. There have been over 35 states that have looked at the value of solar. In 2020 alone, 17 states plus the District of Columbia examined the value of distributed generation. And all these studies that have been done in the U.S. are directly, often either directed by the legislation or regulatory body in each of the states. And they're used to inform policy decision-making. So this is really the some analysis that's presented to the regulator who considers it in creating new policy, but in some cases also used directly in creating solar tariffs. Next slide. So the value of solar methodology attempts to determine what the average benefits and costs of DPV exports are to the power system. So it looks at several different categories of value, which we'll be looking in the following slide. And it looks at the impact given a number of assumptions about the power system as it exists now. Compensating solar exports based on their expected benefit to the system is a way to incentivize grid-friendly behavior from solar and can encourage deployment where they're most desirable because of higher values. Next slide. So the value of solar studies, the 35 that I had mentioned, all include different elements. No solar value study is identical to another in its methodology, and that's in part because of the priorities in a given state or country. But in most cases, you'll have at least 5 types of values that are explored. The first is energy value, and this is really the avoided fuel costs that are related with solar generation. So if a customer self generates their own electricity, that means that the utility doesn't need to either purchase or generate that electricity, and so there are cost savings with not having to purchase or generate that electricity. That's the energy value.
Mr. Nayan, sorry.
Yes, please.
Sorry for interruption. Yes? Can you be a bit louder? Thank you.
Yes, no problem. The second value that we explore is the generating capacity. So the capacity value is of solar is how well can solar replace peak capacity or peaker capacity for a given system. If your peak capacity happens in the beginning of the afternoon, for example, then it's possible that by having distributed solar, you don't need to build as much peaker capacity, which is a cost savings to the utility. Depending on when transmission congestion occurs, you can have transmission capacity value from solar. So this would mean that because of your distributed solar, you are reducing congestion in transmission lines, which therefore allows you not to have to upgrade your transmission lines as soon, which is also a value. And then finally, because distributed solar can offset coal or other dirty fossil fuel generation, there are a number of environmental benefits to solar, which include health benefits, people who are impacted through through particulate emissions, for example, or through coal plants, as well as carbon emission reductions, which of course has value. Next slide. So in doing this, we want to understand how solar impacts the dispatch of other generation to understand what the energy and capacity value are. And the more solar you have in a system, the lower its marginal value. So if you already have a lot of solar in the system, having one extra unit of solar isn't going to provide much value because you've already ramped down a lot of the more expensive conventional generation. So higher levels of solar often leads to lower value of solar. Next slide. So we did this analysis in 2 states, in the state of Gujarat and Jharkhand in India. And we looked at 2 specific grid scenarios. One was a base case where there was current levels of renewable energy in the grid, and one at MNRE goals, which are much higher levels of solar deployment in the grid. We found in both cases, so one thing to note is the Gujarat value was significantly higher than Jharkhand value, which indicates that there's very much a location specific value, and one can't use similar analysis for one region to another because the grid conditions are different from one region to another. The largest category is energy value, so that's the avoided energy costs, and that's the case both in Gujarat and Jharkhand. But then the generation capacity value is only high was only high in Gujarat at these low solar penetration levels. At much higher levels of solar, as I explained, the value decreases, which is definitely, we see this in the results in this table here. Much more detail is available in the report that's linked at the end of this presentation on the results for this particular study. Next slide. So finally, some policy implications of value of solar work. So this value of solar analysis can really inform tariff setting as well as solar compensation mechanisms. So perhaps one can set the PV compensation rate equal to the value, and that will ensure that cross subsidies between customer groups or non-PV adopters and solar adopters is minimized. You may want to use value of solar to identify hotspots for solar and then target incentives to drive more market deployment where the value of solar is highest, which provides more value to the system. You may also be interested in accelerating interconnection processes for those hotspot areas. And finally, time varying rates are one way to kind of encourage exports during high value periods, which you could potentially do through storage. And value of solar analysis can inform these timings. So with that, I will turn it back to Anurag. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naeem. And if I can request all the speakers to switch on their camera as well, or their microphone, so that we can have a Q&A. I will try and start with some of the questions which we've received in the Q&A chat box, but I also see very efficiently all the speakers have responded to them. But I feel there are a few things which we can discuss again. Starting with you, Naeem, one of the question is, do you have any Excel sheet which can help people to do this kind of analysis on their own? And if you can maybe talk about the work which you did for Jharkhand, that might be helpful.
Yes, so in terms of Excel tools, there are no kind of easy tools to use for value of solar analysis. And in part, this is because the energy value from solar is very much dependent on the dispatch of generation in that particular state. And dispatch models are much more complex than and can't usually be done in Excel. That said, there are I can think of one Excel tool that can help you understand some of the concepts, and I'll look for that and see if I can enter that in the chat.
Okay, and one follow-up question to you, Naeem. You spoke about value of solar assessment and the results you showed for Gujarat and Jharkhand states. What happens if the compensation models for rooftop solar are not aligned to the value of solar assessment?
Right. So that's a very good question, and in fact, that's the very reason why so many states in the U.S. and other jurisdictions do value solar studies. If the compensation rates are not aligned with the value of solar, what this means is that there will be a financial impact of the solar deployment. So let's say that the value of solar is lower than the compensation rate. The difference between the two either leads to reduction in net revenues to the utility, or in other cases, retail electricity rates have to increase for the utility to be able to cover their full costs. And sometimes that's a very small amount when there's not much solar, but when there's a lot of solar, this can lead to some increases in retail rates for everyone. And so that's why so many jurisdictions are really trying to understand what the value of solar is and how they can best match the value of solar to the PV compensation level.
Thank you, Nayan. So let me turn to Devina, and there was a question about how do we enforce the rating system, as well as the question around ensuring that the ratings which are awarded are kind of awarded through a fair and transparent process, so that there is no issue about who is like what kind of rating is issued and who is issuing those ratings. So can you answer that, please?
So yes, I
You're
think
on
for this, yes. So for the vendor rating framework, I think here the basic principle is that market is the primary driver. And of course, it is what we are developing. The vendor rating framework is almost on the verge of completion, and we are still undergoing final stage of just implementing the parameters. And the aim here is to make it very user-friendly. So the participation, what we plan to do is going to be on a voluntary basis. And here, I think the vendor rating agency is going to play a very important role in publicizing what will be the benefits of the VRF and how the vendors will be able to get an opportunity to improve their systems and at the same time continuously improve their ratings. So I think to make it more proper enforce and compliance, it is important that we gradually start by spreading the word and spreading how the vendors will get benefit from this vendor rating framework. And of course, that will help us in a wider implementation of this framework, and then maybe just gradually spread to a national level of force.
And the other question I have to you, Devina, you spoke about the rating framework and the parameters you are using for doing this assessment for individual vendors. How relevant these parameters are for use by other countries, knowing that we're using similar technologies, probably have similar challenges. So what are your views about parameters?
So of course, I feel that India is not alone in facing these issues and challenges. The issues and challenges that I talked about is on a global level. And for instance, if you look at component failures and or difficulty in distinguishing between what is a high quality when component or a low quality when component, and the standards, of course, I think all these pieces are seen in our vendor rating framework, where we talk about the lack of awareness or training, and it is being catered to from our vendor rating framework. So if these issues are something that is common across globally, I'm sure the vendor rating framework will play an important role. But of course, it has to be tweaked and twisted according to the needs and requirements of other countries. And this is alongside the standards that are already in place, the international and national standards.
Okay, thanks, Devina. Coming to you, Sumit, and the business model you presented for low-paying consumers, and their question about the gap between the current social tariff, the cost of supply is pretty high, as you mentioned yourself. Then comparing that gap between like the social tariff and the cost of solar, it does help with reducing some of the subsidy requirements, but it does not fully eliminate that requirement in terms of continuously providing the subsidy. So what are your kind of thoughts around the ways utilities can look at strategy in the long term where they don't have to provide these subsidies on a continuous basis?
Yeah, it's a good question, Anurag. So basically, there are 2, 3 things here. What exactly we are trying to get the benefit out of this model implementation is we are reducing the cost of power procurement when we say that we are co-locating the supply and the demand. So you're reducing losses as well as you're reducing the cost of supply. Now, that tariff and the gap gets socialized. I do agree that you cannot reduce or you cannot eliminate the subsidy part in full amount. But yes, that will be gradually released as the volume or economies of scale increase. And Discom now need to rethink the way they are working upon, because initially they were more acting as a facilitator, but now they have to act as a investor also. They are investing, and that's slowly and slowly this particular thing once progressed at a larger level, because domestic low paying consumers are the largest in the category segment. That itself will create a huge force to reduce it to a very negligible amount.
Okay, thank you. And while you mentioned about the pilot projects which have been kind of planned and to be rolled out in the state of Jharkhand, if we were to kind of really looking at this as one of the potential solution and accrue all the benefits which you highlighted for one of the state, like just having 15% of distributed solar, so much of savings can be achieved. Uh, what role the regulatory provisions will play in scaling it up at a really large scale, and why they are so important to have in place so that these models can be enabled?
That's a very good question, Anurag. So regulator has a very important role to play because they have to create certain enabling policies which are right now not present. Two comes in my mind. One is to have a adequate compensation mechanism established where you know what kind of compensation should go to the consumer, because he would be leasing his roof. So either it is kind of a lease which should be there, or it should be reduction in the tariff bill that has to be properly addressed. And the second piece is these consumers actually are having a very less contracted load. So what exactly the current regulation prevail is that you can only go till 80% of the contracted capacity. So that kind of upper limit relaxation in the contractual load is something which regulators have to relook upon, so that the roof or the developer has a more better demand there, and discoms also can have a higher value to play with. So these are the two things, apart from the other things which right now should be the focus of the regulators to work upon.
Thank you, Sumit. Coming to you, Karishma, we're seeing that the cost of energy storage technologies are falling. But even with that cost reduction, the solutions are still expensive. So why do you think the country should start looking at behind the meter storage as one of the feasible solutions? And just to kind of back your kind of analysis or kind of response, if there is any analysis or quantitative analysis you have undertaken to look into what is the payback for a customer with storage or without storage DPV. Over.
Thank you, Anurag. All good questions. I'll start, and then Naeem has actually done some of the analysis, so I'll pass it on to him. But I think, I alluded to this a little bit in my presentation. I think, it's around the corner. It behooves us to be, to future-proof this and enabling, storage or regulations that enable storage can help support not just customer needs, but also grid needs. And I think that's singularly the, most important thing, to make sure that we're sending those right price signals. And, so what the customers are seeing is what the grid also needs. And so by being forward thinking and helping to set up a framework that helps support that. So even though it's expensive now, this will help countries be prepared for when that is, it makes more economic sense. And then to that second point, I'll set it up and then hand it off to Naeem. We did do some customer economic analysis in Gujarat, and Naeem, maybe you can speak more broadly about it as well. And we looked at, payback time, but then also what happens if the price of storage goes down, and then why it doesn't make sense. So Naeem, I'll hand it off to you.
Sure. Yeah. So thanks. So a few things to note. One is that the customer economics of storage really depends on the underlying retail rates as well as the compensation mechanism. For the retail rates, what storage can do, it can do some kind of arbitrage between the peak and the off-peak period. So store during off-peak times, discharge during peak times. So the greater the peak to off-peak differential in your tariff, the more attractive it is to the customer. It can reduce demand charges when there are some by reducing discharging the battery during the customer's peak load time. And then finally, for the PV compensation mechanism, when there's net billing, so that's when exports are compensated at a lower rate than your retail tariff, then instead of exporting or injecting that electricity into the grid, you can store your electricity into a storage system and then discharge later on. So in Gujarat, for example, we did this analysis, and it doesn't necessarily it isn't profitable for someone to invest in it now, given the tariffs today. But in another country, in other situations, you couldn't have storage even at today's cost be attractive. And of course, the lower the costs of storage, the more attractive it will be given a set of tariffs. And all this analysis can be done using some National Renewable Energy Lab tools, such as the System Advisor model and REOPT Lite, which are two tools that are freely available online.
Thank you, Naeem. So let me turn to Dr. Goyal. And there was a question in the Q&A box about the role of distribution utilities in enabling DPV systems, and you kind of responded to that briefly. But I just want to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to expand that, knowing that utilities will play a very, very important role. And the 4 ideas which we discussed today, all of them are kind of centered around utilities. So we just can't really ignore utilities and not have them part of the solution. But I'd like to hear a little more from you, Dr. Goyal.
Thank you, Anurag. DISCOMs, as everybody agrees, is on the central pivot for all these developments. Unfortunately, so far in the programs, you said they are more used as a passive facilitator, something going on between the government and the customers. But going forward, if the DISCOMs and the utilities also have to survive and keep their business intact, and I will say even growing, they need to shift from the facilitator to the generator and to the investors. And these model, particularly the super resto model, which has been developed, makes the utility more as an investor and as a generator also. Because the solar rooftop which will be developed and the consumer premises will actually be owned by the DISCOMs. And the generation will be by the DISCOMs, and the consumer will remain as a consumer. Now, similarly in the C&I customers also, commercial and industrial customers, those who are implementing the solar, because DISCOMs is not providing them, there also DISCOM should make an inroad and say, friends, we will implement the solar for you. We have an expertise. We have all the wherewithal in much larger, with more economic and the efficiency, and you continue to do your business. I think most of the commercial and industrial customers will like that idea, because electricity generation is not their core business. But then to do that, utilities and the DISCOMs really need to change their mindset and move from this that part of the monopolistic business, and they will remain as a facilitator only. They need to take a step forward and make use of this and pass the benefit to the customers also of the low cost we are coming. In all the 4 models that we have developed and presented here, the DISCOM role is very, very central. And we worked in this program with 2 DISCOMs with our partner state in Assam and Jharkhand. And this has been debated long and discussed with them, and they agree that this is the right thing. And now many other states are coming forward to that. I will also like to add a point to this social cost and the subsidy part also. Now, electricity subsidy and the subsidy in general is a very important topic. The subsidies were there, and subsidies I see will continue to remain there also. What is more important in the subsidy is that they are being given to the right people and in the right quantity. Now, to decide this, in India, in the current amendment of the bill, there is a mechanism which is coming a direct subsidy, and electricity tariff will be unsubsidized. So the subsidy amount will be given to the customers, and it will be left to the customer to utilize it for purchasing more electricity or for purchasing more kerosene or for doing something else. So these are the things which are coming, which will reduce that point of socializing the cost and reducing the subsidy also. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Goyal. So I have one last question for Sumedh, and then I would also like to give all the speakers an opportunity to share like one final thought in like 20 seconds each. But kind of giving you time to think about it while I ask this question to Sumedh. So Sumedh, you presented a very interesting business model, the super risk model, and showed all the benefits and are really kind of encouraging numbers which the distribution utilities should be looking at. But can you also point to what are the limitations of this RISCO, the super
Right.
RISCO model?
So, so Anurag, there are few limitations. One is consumer acquisition. Rooftop lease because DISCOM, this RESCO model basically rests upon leasing the rooftop, having a power purchase agreement. So rooftop lease for a long term, say 25 years. Compensation mechanism, financial liability. These are the areas which has to be worked out well for ensuring that super RESCO model remains successful. And keeping this in mind, PhD program is working closely with Jharkhand to implement a pilot project on this model. What I say that here is like implementation of this model will help us to understand and capture the learnings and share it with our relevant stakeholders. So in summary, this consumer, how to acquire consumers, how to lease, these are the areas which still pose a limitation and require some on-ground experiments so that it can be debated, defined again, and make more successful for a national scale.
Thanks, Sumedh. So let's turn to our panelists and just starting in a reverse sequence. So starting with Naeem, you have 20 seconds.
Sure. So as we have more solar deployment, it's going to be increasingly important to understand the value of that solar deployment in order to get the compensation levels correct and not have kind of a large impact on rates or on utility revenues.
Thanks, Naeem. Over to you, Karishma.
Thank you. I'll just say that, when we're thinking of DPV plus storage, many countries, as we talked about, already have regulations governing, the installation and deployment of DPV. And it's simply an incremental effort, I should say simply, but it is often an incremental effort to add storage to existing DPV regulations. So, it's not like devising new regulations altogether, but just making an incremental change to existing regulations. So that'll be my 20-second sign off.
All right. Sumedh.
Yeah, so thanks, Anurag. So basically, my take is that DISCOM now needs to be the part of the solution because fulcrum of any success now lies on DISCOM in this renewable rich era, and that has to be captured well.
Thanks. Over to you, Devina.
Thank you, Anurag. So yes, as I just mentioned, that India is not alone. The solar quality and safety issues have global experiences. And it is important that the demonstration of such quality products can only happen if the information reaches the consumers in a very clear way. And a successful approach is to just improve the rooftop PV installations or solar installations quality and include an assortment of strategy that focuses on all the stakeholders.
Thank you, Devina. Dr. Goyal.
I will just extend the Sumed's words, involve all stakeholders for scaling distributed PV. Their involvement is very, very essential. DISCOM already Sumed told, I will add customers and investors also. They are being involved, but more deeper involvement is needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goyal. So with that, I'll thank all the panelists for your presentation and answering all the questions, and also kind of your response to a surprise last minute set of questions. So with that, let me turn it back to Pramod Singh. He's the COP for the South Asia Regional Energy Hub of USAID India program for his concluding remarks. Over to you, Pramod.
Yeah, thank you, Anurag. And on behalf of the entire organizing team, I'm thankful to our participants for their time today. Like all of our previous webinars, the recording and presentations will be shared with everyone. And I'm grateful to you, Anurag and USAID, for guiding us in the preparation of this webinar. My sincere thanks to the PhD 2.0 RE team, which is managed by Tetra Tech, and thanks to our partners NREL and LBNL for associating with us on this webinar. Thank you to all the speakers, Rakesh sir, Sumed, Devina, Karishma, and Naim for their time and for sharing their insights and experience. I will just say few takeaway points from today's discussion. As Rakesh sir mentioned, scaling means satisfying all stakeholders, government, utility, customers, and RESCOs. So that's very important. Devina brought an interesting point, and there is a saying that the bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of low price is over. So it's very important to focus on the quality and safety aspect. Thanks for sharing the framework, and also to highlight that the 70% weightage in that framework is given to on-site inspection and not just on paper evaluation. Thank you, Sumedh, for sharing the utility-driven RESCO model. Hopefully, it will unlock opportunities in the low-paying customer segment. Thank you, Naim, for presenting a methodology that estimates value of solar, and I'm very optimistic that this methodology will be used by regulators, utilities, and government when it comes to tariff setting and compensation mechanism for solar. Karishma, thank you once again for highlighting the benefits of DPV and storage, and also sharing how a program can be designed keeping DPV plus storage in mind. I'm also thankful to my own team, SAREH team, for organizing this webinar. We had close to 300 registrations from 30 countries. Those who are not aware about SAREH and joining us for the first time, it's a platform created by USAID for facilitating regional energy integration, not through infrastructure, but through exchange of knowledge, ideas, and experience. That's the way we are following. So please watch out our social media space for future updates. So with these words, we move to the end. Thank you once again. Thank you for your time. Take care and have a good day, good evening from wherever you are reached. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.